B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, News and Comment. It's Wednesday, October 23rd, 2019. It seems like Republicans are feeling the heat from the impeachment investigation focused on Ukrainegate. And about 24 of the far-right Trump loyalists, members of the House of Representatives, staged a stunt today where they went to the basement hearing room, the SCIF, where the impeachment investigation interviews are being conducted, and they staged a little protest. They made a lot of noise, and they acted as if Adam Schiff and the Democrats are conducting secret hearings that Republicans are not permitted to participate in. And it's flat-out bullshit. They are trying to make a stand here, create a perception that Trump has been driving, that this is an unfair and unbalanced, unconstitutional impeachment process. But the fact is that the Republicans who sit on the three committees, Intelligence, Foreign Affairs, and Oversight, are full participants in these interviews with various subjects. And so it is a false point that is designed to mislead low-information voters and people who are inclined to believe Trump's tweets. So 24 House Republicans chanting, "Let us in, let us in," tried to storm the room where the hearings are being held, and Laura Cooper, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, was scheduled to be interviewed, and I learned just before I sat down here that the interview did continue after about a 3-hour delay. The Democrats had to call in the Sergeant of Arms and try to persuade the Republicans to stand down. And the hyperbole is predictable. Andy Biggs of Arizona called it a Soviet-style impeachment process. And Jim Jordan, the discredited wrestling coach from Ohio State, he said it's finally reached a point where members just said they're so frustrated at the idea that they can't be a part of this and see what's going on. So we're at a standstill. So this is a big smokescreen. And let's be fair, Democrats are running some of their own stunts. They have a bill in the House called the SHIELD Act that would require candidates to tell law enforcement authorities of any efforts to influence U.S. elections by foreign governments or those acting on their behalf. It would also close loopholes that allow foreign governments and foreign nationals to spend money in American elections. Now, they know full well that they can pass this out of the House, and it is dead on arrival in the U.S. Senate. And so, relegate that to the stunt department. And get this, I pay attention, and I think I know a fair amount about who's serving in Washington and what's going on there. But I want to credit BuzzFeed, the listicle-centric news site aimed at younger people, because I did not know that Mike Pence has a big brother named Greg, and that last year Greg took over the old congressional seat from Indiana that Mike once occupied. And get this, Greg is on the Foreign Affairs Committee of the House, and as a freshman member, he has access to all the closed-door testimonies, and that, of course, undermines the stunt that the Republicans pulled today. Because there are plenty of Republicans, including those with a direct pipeline to the White House. You could even call him a mole. And so while I would agree that some of the optics here are not perfect, they keep goading Pelosi to stage a full vote of the House on impeachment. She doesn't have to, but I do think that it's something that will eventually occur. And so the idea that she is protecting her vulnerable members from taking a position on this is short-term. But she may have other reasons, and I do respect the strategic thinking of Nancy Pelosi when it comes to maneuvers in her House of Representatives. Over at the Washington Post today, they published a little list of kind of the evidence and the individuals involved so far in the impeachment inquiry. And it's interesting because Bill Taylor, William B. Taylor, who is the acting ambassador to Ukraine, gave some pretty stunning testimony yesterday. But let me just recap for you. In the last 4 weeks, we first heard from Joe McGuire, the acting director of National Intelligence. That's kind of faded. Kurt Volker was the guy who came up to the Hill and shared those damaging emails and text messages between him and Gordon Sondland and Bill Taylor. Marie Yovanovitch, the former ambassador, offered a fascinating perspective on why she was yanked out of Ukraine. And then Fiona Hill is the one who told us how John Bolton was raging red after he heard about what he called a drug deal that was being cooked up by Giuliani and others. George Kent mostly covered his ass. We don't know much about what Mike McKinley, the former advisor to Secretary of State Pompeo, said beyond his resignation because of Yovanovitch and other issues. And Laura Cooper is testifying, but I don't have any details of her ability to confirm what she knew about the put on the military aid for Ukraine. So I will say that my original posture of skepticism is still warranted here, and that I do believe that if the Democrats only produce articles of impeachment related to Ukraine, that that's a big mistake. But I will acknowledge that this testimony is revealing, and it reveals a deep rot in the Trump administration, even rottier than we thought. And as we'll detail in a moment, the tentacles extend to the Attorney General, to the recently announced outgoing Secretary of Energy, dumb Rick Perry, and a handful of others. So I expected today a tweet storm against Bill Taylor, led by Trump. And the best he could summon was a weak quote from a congressman who's a fan of Trump's, John Ratcliffe. I think he's a Texas guy. And he said, well, there's no quo in the quid pro quo. And that appears to be all he could do. And so Trump changed the subject, and as we will get to shortly, decided to declare declare victory in Syria as a way to distract Americans today. Now, it's interesting. The New York Times has published a piece that could be quite significant here. And it speaks directly to undermining Trump's claim that there wasn't any quo in the quid pro quo because Ukraine didn't know that Trump had ordered the military aid package withheld. Well, according to the New York Times, and get this, it's based on unnamed sources and presumed documents or documents they refer to but don't publish. And what they're telling us is word of the aid freeze had reached high-level Ukrainian officials by the first week in August. And that's critical. The phone call where Trump put the pressure on, whether you call it a quid pro quo or not, was July 25th. Then early August, we are told without proof that the Ukrainian leadership knew about that. Trump claims they didn't find out until Zelensky went to Poland and had a meeting with Mike Pence. So that is crucial to the activities of Ukrainians during the month of August, when they were trying to appease Trump. You got this new president, former, he was like Jon Stewart. All right, he had a political comedy show in Ukraine, and he's suddenly elected president. He has a medium to hot war on his eastern border with Russia. And he is kind of desperate, not only for the U.S. aid, but also just the moral support. And as Trump, threatens to pull the slats out from under that, you can understand that the Ukrainians were trying to figure out what the hell was going on and what they had to do. And we know that somebody at the Pentagon relayed word to Zelensky that you ought to get in touch with Mick Mulvaney, the acting permanent White House chief of staff. And so it dawned on the Ukrainians during the month of August that they were being blackmailed, and that Trump clearly was withholding the release of the aid and an invitation for a White House visit by Zelensky, with a clear demand that before either of those would occur, that Zelensky would either read a statement written by U.S. officials, go on CNN and tell them he had ordered an investigation into Burisma and, at least by implication, the Bidens, and also the 2016 issues that Trump is obsessed with. And it's forced Zelensky to do this dance, where at a news conference earlier this month he said there was no blackmail. He claims he had no idea of the military aid being held up at the time of the July 25th call, and that appears to be accurate based on what we know. And he has said that he knew about the holdup before the meeting in Poland with Pence on September 1st, but he's been vague about when and how he did learn about it. So I appreciate the pickle that Zelensky is in. And faced with what Mr. Taylor yesterday detailed as unusual twin pipelines of U.S. foreign policy in Ukraine. He said, there was the ordinary channel that I was running as the acting ambassador, and then I discovered there's this Giuliani operation. And Taylor was pretty polite, at least in the quotes that I've seen, in the way he described the Giuliani scammers. Now, one of the weaknesses here that we will have to deal with, let me first say that I think Taylor is a very credible witness. He doesn't appear to be partisan. He doesn't appear to have baggage where Trump can attack him falsely. But Peter Baker, the analyst at the New York Times, had to concede in the publicly released portion of his testimony, Taylor neither described any direct conversation with Trump himself, nor made any reference to documents or recordings that would explicitly implicate the president. Instead, he provided a roadmap for investigators by quoting others around Trump, describing his actions and statements. So when you hear Rachel Maddow and others use the phrase smoking gun, I think we have a gun that's loaded, but I don't believe we have yet seen the smoke. And it is quite clear when you look at all the people who have so far refused to appear before the congressional investigation, including Giuliani's buddies Lev and Igor. We'll get to them in a minute. The defense secretary, the vice president, Giuliani, Pompeo, Rick Perry. So as they are forced to testify, assuming that Trump can't find a way to block it, this could become very damaging. We could see some serious articles of impeachment. There is the surfacing of some cracks in the unity of Republican opposition, and Trump's use of the term lynching, Trump's policy in Syria. All of those have caused many Republicans to say, wow, he could cost me my job. And I have long argued that the Democrats should have brought impeachment after Michael Cohen pled guilty to the scheme that directly implicated Trump, because once you do this, it snowballs, and it's the risk, the gamble you have to take, that you can bring public opinion and a bunch of Republican senators along with you in order to turn the tide and remove a president. It's not easy. But I still believe the Democrats bungled by waiting this late in the process. I only heard Rush Limbaugh for a minute this morning, but his whole rant was that this is just part of the 2020 campaign. This is all politics, folks. You can ignore it. This is just the Democrats using impeachment to try to win at the polls. Now, one element of Taylor's testimony yesterday related to the Attorney General. Now, we know that Trump, in the phone call July 25th, told Zelensky to talk to both Giuliani and William Barr. Barr said, nobody ever told me about that, and acted like he was not in the loop. And the testimony of the various individuals increasingly, I think, shows that that isn't true. So Taylor testified that on a call, Gordon Sondland, the EU ambassador who bought his post, stated that Trump told him he wanted Zelensky to publicly pledge investigations. Taylor claimed that Sondland told him that release of the money was dependent on it. And then he says, we also discussed the possibility that the Ukrainian prosecutor general, rather than President Zelensky, would make a statement about investigations, potentially in coordination with Attorney General Barr's probe into the investigation of the Mueller investigation. So this suggests that at least some people were scheming to use Bill Barr. Was he willing in this matter? Well, what this outlines is that this is a virus that could infect every major cabinet member in the Trump administration. How do we impeach them all? Now we learn that Igor and Lev, that would be Igor Fruman and Lev Parnas, they pled not guilty in court today, faced with an indictment of campaign finance violations. And BuzzFeed reports a federal grand jury investigating activities shows extravagant spending at Trump hotels and millions of dollars in financial transfers by Parnas and Fruman. And they go into some detail, $3 million of money transfers into accounts belonging to Parnas, and they bounced money back and forth. A small amount went to a guy named Correa, who's one of the other two people who've been indicted in this case. And about $250,000 was sent to California for an investment in a cannabis business run by a Russian guy who lives in a mansion in the East Bay of San Francisco. So this is a further development. We don't know where all that money came from, and that will be investigated. We'll see where it leads. Next up, a piece by Aaron Blake at the Washington Post today. He basically, kind of punches back at various commentary that is coming from Republicans and their defense of Donald Trump. For example, the idea that quid pro quos happen all the time. Mick Mulvaney, saying we do that all the time with foreign policy. And Blake argues back, of course, quid pro quos are part of government work. What this is really about is whether there was a corrupt quid pro quo. The question is whether it involved Trump's personally desired investigations, which would benefit him politically. Number two, Sondland and others say, gosh, we didn't know that Burisma and an investigation of them had anything to do with the Bidens. But this seems to be hogwash. Trump and his personal lawyer, Giuliani, made no secret that this was about the Bidens. There was a major controversy in May when Giuliani planned and canceled a trip to Ukraine, where he explicitly said he was going to push for these investigations. Trump himself invoked the Bidens publicly on May 19th and again in that phone call with Zelensky on July 25th. Then efforts to denounce the whistleblowers at the CIA who still have not produced anything new other than the initial whistleblower letter. The Republicans are trying to just say, because Trump released that partial transcript, and I firmly believe it's not a complete transcript, that settles it all. So, there's a lot of bullshit, a lot of dissembling that is going on, and it will ultimately soil the people who continue to defend Trump against what is clearly indefensible. And Trump's Twitter mob been pretty busy attacking Adam Schiff. Now, he invited this. I've been critical of that comment he made at the opening of a hearing where the phone partial transcript had been released, and he says he did a parody of it. And then he got caught lying about the timeline of when he knew about the whistleblower and suggestions that there was some coaching of the whistleblower by staff from Schiff's Intelligence Committee. But that doesn't justify the kind of, attacks, including death threats, that are being aimed at Schiff in this case. Now, in another stunt, as we reported, the House Republicans tried to lead a censure vote against Adam Schiff. And on Monday night, Steny Hoyer, the number 2 House Democrat, he sponsored a motion to table it, and so it is dead on the floor of the House. Every day I pause for a minute to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. Let's drop some names. How about Alice Carlson, Susan Lewis, John Morgan, and Judy Holloway? They each kick in $5, maybe $10 a month to support me, and you can do it too. All you got to do is visit peterbcollins.com, click on the menu tab, click on Become a Subscriber. You'll hit the sign-up page. Easy to choose a PayPal subscription that's comfortable for your budget. If you don't like PayPal, I don't blame you. You can communicate directly with me at P.O. Box 150, 660, San Rafael, California, 94915. And yes, I do have bonus books. And I want to mention one more time that Thursday night in San Rafael, I will be moderating a panel including our local district attorney, Tony Platt, who is a longtime expert on criminal justice, and a woman, Ann Stuhl, I can't summon her full name, but she is working in the city of San Francisco to reduce the onerous impact of fines and fees on the indigent people, which often leads to a cycle of can't pay it, you got to go to jail. And so I think it's going to be an interesting panel. I've put up a link to the ACLU information. It's in the show file for today's podcast at peterbcollins.com. Now that I've made that promise, I got to make a note to post it. So I mentioned earlier that Trump needed to change the subject after the pretty devastating testimony of Bill Taylor. And so this morning, he announced that the U.S. has brokered a permanent ceasefire in northeast Syria, taking credit for a tentative deal that will be enforced by Turkey and Russia, and lifting sanctions that he imposed on Turkey after they invaded the Kurdish-run areas south of its border. Now, he described this as a triumph of his diplomacy. And he said, "Let someone else fight over this long blood-stained sand." And as usual, the photo op included the silent presence of Mike Pence, Mike Pompeo, and his latest national security advisor, Bob O'Brien. So Trump said, "The government of Turkey informed my administration they would be stopping combat and their offensive in Syria and making the ceasefire permanent." So he's trying to put a real spin on this, showing that he's the president who is ending our enduring wars. But, little problems keep creeping up. For example, the up to 1,000 troops that were in Syria that Trump says he's pulling out, some of them were dispatched to neighboring Iraq, where the Iraqis say these soldiers are not welcome. And it appears we didn't even ask. And the latest defense secretary and former Raytheon lobbyist, Mark Esper, was in Baghdad to discuss the redeployment of American troops after Iraq its military announced its opposition to their redeployment in that part of Iraq. So it just keeps getting messier and messier. There is a scheduled visit by Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the defiant leader of Turkey, who just this week was palling around with Vladimir Putin, which really riles a lot of the Russophobes in Washington. And Mitch McConnell has introduced a resolution urging Trump to rescind the invitation until a genuine ceasefire is reached. Now, I tuned out on Thomas Friedman during the Iraq War. He would write these columns saying, in just 6 more months, everything's going to change. And every 6 months, things got worse, and he would still write these rosy predictions. So get his loaded headline today at the New York Times. Trump's Syria trifecta. A win for Putin. Yeah, we got to get the Russophobia in there first. A loss for the Kurds, and lots of uncertainty for our allies. And then there's a sub-headline, it's pure genius. So this mockery, which is the official line of the New York Times and most of the corporate media, it's really even infected the Associated Press coverage in recent weeks. Well, he begins with a citation of Tony Blair. Remember? Bush's poodle, the British Prime Minister who supported the invasion of Iraq? And just before we went in, he gave a speech to Congress where he imagined somebody in a dark corner of the United States happily minding his own business and saying, "Why me? Why us? Why America?" And Blair's answer, because destiny puts you in this place in history, in this moment in time, and the task is yours to do. So Friedman is still imbued with American exceptionalism and a promotion of American imperialism. We are indispensable, he believes. He writes, after 4 decades of a foreign policy built around containment of the Soviet Union, then 2 decades of foreign policy built around enlarging the sphere of democracy around the world, Americans want a break. Well, this is neocon bullshit. It was Trump who said he was going to bring democracy to Iraq. Only they don't know democracy and they don't particularly want it. But later in his article, Friedman notes that even if you argue that walking away from the Kurds in Syria was the right, cold-blooded, strategic thing to do, notice the passive voice there? He then dings Trump for the manner in which he did it, and, that's not out of bounds. And one more quote, he cites Michael Mandelbaum, author of The Rise and Fall of Peace on Earth, who says, when we suddenly withdraw our support for an ally with no warning, we call into question our credibility everywhere. And in the voice of Friedman, that is not an argument for sustaining bad wars forever, like Vietnam. It is an argument for ending them in ways that don't unnerve your allies. Next up, Ben Norton, over at the Gray Zone Project, notes that Trump has changed his tune, and we talked about this yesterday. And I don't know if he's being wagged by a dog or what. But he modified his stance on withdrawal from Syria, saying we're going to keep a couple of hundred in that northeast area to protect the oil from ISIS. Now, Ben Norton notes that Trump has called for taking the oil. And in a tweet about 5 days ago, he noted the U.S. has secured the oil. Now, his surface argument that he is securing it so the Islamic State can't turn it into cash. But Mark Esper, that former Raytheon executive I mentioned, and he's playing Secretary of Defense now, he said, we have troops in towns in northeast Syria that are located next to the oil fields. The troops in those towns are not in the present phase of withdrawal. Our forces will remain in the towns that are located near the oil fields. Now, Trump had criticized Obama and Bush for not taking the Iraqi oil, and we have to suspect that that's what he has up his sleeve in this case. Yesterday, Washington went bonkers when Trump used the term lynching to describe his sense of impeachment. And it caused Joe Biden to issue an apology because back in '99 when Bill Clinton was impeached, he referred to it as a political lynching. At any rate, currently, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals in Atlanta is hearing a case arguing that grand jury documents and records should be unsealed from a 1946 event, which is described as one of the last lynchings in Georgia. And a 3-judge panel ruled in February to uphold a lower court's order not to release the documents, but the full court voted to rehear the case, and the oral arguments were heard yesterday. So lynching as a thing is still an ugly remnant of Jim Crow that exists here in the United States. Well, Trump and his cronies have tried every which way to kill Obamacare, but it lives on. According to Health and Human Services, we have a second year of positive growth. An additional 20 insurers will participate for 2020, expanding consumer choice in many states. And get this, premiums for a hypothetical 27-year-old choosing a standard plan will decline by 4% next year in states served by the federal healthcare.gov website. Yes, premiums actually going down. Now, as you know, I'm not a fan of Obamacare. I want Medicare for all. But I also deplore the insidious efforts to try to kill it and never replace it, simply deny health insurance to many Americans who desperately need it. In the effort to force release of Trump's tax records, judges on a 3-member panel in Manhattan peppered a lawyer for Trump who had asserted mind-boggling immunity for the president. One of the panelists said, "We don't have to confront the question of whether the president is immune from indictment and prosecution. The issue right now is investigation." And Trump's lawyer, William Consovoy, said the president's immunity even extended to Trump's imaginary claim that he could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue. General counsel for the DA in Manhattan asked that lawyer, Consovoy, would local police be disabled from restraining such a person or processing such a person? Would we have to wait for an impeachment proceeding? And another judge posed the hypothetical to Consovoy. Local authorities couldn't investigate. They couldn't do anything about it. Nothing could be done. That's your position? Consovoy, that is correct. That is correct. Unbelievable. Here in California, we are facing a lawsuit from the Justice Department that might have some legal merit. I don't like the outcome, but California made a compact with Quebec and another province in Canada, I believe Nova Scotia, related to a cap-and-trade program. Yeah, it's California, Quebec, and Nova Scotia. And the Trump Justice Department is arguing that California is merely a state and that this is an international agreement that is the purview of the federal government. And I'm afraid they might be legally correct. I want to commend Mint Press News today for a story regarding Congresswoman Betty McCollum, Democrat from Minnesota, who is continuing her efforts to force the government of Israel to change its ugly treatment of underage Palestinians. Some are children, some are teenagers. But the numbers are astounding, that there are hundreds of Palestinians who are in custody in Israel today. The current number in 2019 is 185 Palestinian children, including 2 younger than 14 years of age, were held in various Israeli prisons as of August of this year. And 98% of the children held have been subjected to psychological or physical abuse while in Israeli custody, according to the Palestinian Prisoners Association. Right on, Betty McCollum. We have been watching the situation in Bolivia, where the one of the last of the socialists, Evo Morales, claimed victory in the recent election. And there were some anomalies here where there was a pause in the vote count for hours, and then when it resumed, it put Morales just ahead of the 10% advantage that he needed to avoid a runoff. But the riots that have broken out, the claims by the United States that this is not a legitimate election, it smells like another U.S.-backed coup attempt to my trained nostrils. Over in Chile, the billionaire president, Sebastián Piñera, has called for modest rises to low incomes. He wants to increase taxes on the rich after the 5th night of rioting, arson, and attacks in the streets. I don't know if he'll be able to buy peace there. And finally today, Mark Zuckerberg testifying before Maxine Waters and the Financial Services Committee of the House today. And she grilled him on the political ads policy. And I have to say that I find Zuckerberg's testimony underwhelming and not really persuasive, and that he doesn't see a difference between paid political ads and the freedom of speech that he extends to his individual users, I think is pretty crazy. So Facebook has increased its spending on lobbying in Washington. They spent about $12.5 million last year. They've already spent $12.5 million this year. And Zuck tried to downplay the impact and the importance of the political ads. He said, the very small percent of our business that's made up of political ads doesn't come anywhere close to justifying the kind of controversy that the company's experienced. Well, that's an irrelevant point. Nobody cares what percentage the political ads have. It's what impact they have and whether Facebook knowingly enables campaigns and candidates to tell lies. They're not required to do that. They choose to enumerate that standard. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You'll find it on YouTube. You're free to share it everywhere. And I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.